I was almost kidnapped. When I was 6 years old, my dad got a new job. My family had to move to a bigger city in the middle of the state. The city was known for its crime, but I never really worried about it. We lived in one of the safer neighborhoods. I would often hear cop sirens at night when falling asleep. Sometimes this scared me, but not usually. Our neighbors also had this huge dog that barked and growled constantly, especially when she saw anyone she didn't know. I also had a dog, but she was not big or scary. She was the exact opposite, and she was a fluffy, cute poodle dog that rarely barked at anything or anyone. It was my job to take her out to do her business, and would often complain about it, but would eventually do it anyway. I was the one who wanted the dog after all. One day, about a year after we moved, I was out with Baby in our backyard. I was super bored, and for some reason thought to go to walk in the front yard. This wasn't anything I hadn't done before. I would often walk Baby in the backyard, front yard, and down our street. It was a dead-end road. I would also walk her in our neighbor's front yard, the one without the big dog on the other side of our house. The old man who lived there was super nice, and even let my family use his pool a couple of times. He didn't mind if the neighborhood kids walked around his driveway, as he didn't get out much and figured someone should use it. It was a super big, circular driveway with a huge metal slide in the middle. It was woodsy property and had an overgrown look, so it would be hard for kids to mess up anything. And this particular day, after walking around my front yard, I walked over to his. Baby and I went around the driveway a couple of times before heading back to our house. His house was separated from mine by a small strip of trees with a little clearing in the middle connecting the two properties. As soon as I made it back to my driveway, I saw a small black car pull into his. I didn't think much about it at first, as the old man had lots of family members come to visit at all different hours. The car didn't take the loop towards his house, though. It came the opposite way toward my house, following the way I just came. I became really alarmed with the car. It pulled off the driveway into the small clearing in the separated trees. The car door opened, and a man got halfway out of the car. I couldn't really see his face, and he was dressed in dark clothes. I think he was wearing black gloves too, but can't say for sure. He was careful not to let me see his whole face, keeping it hidden behind the top of the car door. And there was another passenger too. I think it was a woman, but the windows were really dark so I couldn't tell. The man pulled out some cheap candies. You know, the ones they handed out when you were good in school. And he said in the most non-threatening family voice, "Hey, do you want some candy?" Everything in my body was freaking out now. I couldn't believe a strange man was actually offering me candy. And such cheap candies as Smarties. I stayed there for a second before screaming, "No!" I picked up Baby and I ran back to my house, which wasn't too far away. I don't look back and slam the door shut when I get inside. My mom said, "That was a short walk." "Yeah," I replied. I took Baby to my room and looked out the window. I didn't see the car or the people anywhere. I told Baby we must never tell anyone about what happened, because at the time, it made me feel super embarrassed. I think I may have told my brother eventually, but I'm not sure. Years later, after graduating college, I tell my dad, who freaks out about it. He said I should have told him right away, and I should have, but I was a scared little kid. Even more recently, I told my mom, and she basically said the same thing. I'm just so glad that my parents and kindergarten teachers taught me not to take candy from strangers, because God only knows what would have happened to me if I told the stranger, yes. Drug dealer. Many of you might know part of this story already, but I'm going to tell the rest of it. Before my brother passed away, he had a friend who was a drug dealer named Mark. At first, my sister and I liked Mark. He seemed like a really genuine guy. My sister and I don't do drugs, so we didn't buy anything from him. My late brother unfortunately did do a lot of drugs. That's probably how he knew Mark. Eventually, when my brother wasn't around, Mark would come to the house and try to sell things to me and my sister. When my brother found out, he was furious. He told him that he better never come to my house, ever again. Well, of course, Mark didn't listen, and several times he would start coming over to the house. My brother ended his friendship with him and told him that he would, basically kill him if he ever came back to our house again. Of course, the person in the picture right now is my brother, so you could tell that if he wanted to hurt somebody, he could. Well, as all of you know, my brother passed away. On the day that he did, Mark came over to our house, was giving us hugs, and then again asked us if we wanted drugs. Found out later he went to my mom's store. My mom had never met him before in her life, and she was the manager of a Dollar General store. And he started hugging her and making her uncomfortable. We're not a touchy-feely family, really. And she didn't know who this guy was. Well, after my brother passed, he would come over all the time. He would ask to borrow money. He would try to sell us stuff again, not things that we would want to buy. But I'll tell you when the thing got really, really bad. I got paid, and I needed a ride to the store, because my brother used to drive us to the store. We don't have a car. Mark took us to the store, and then he asked me if he could borrow $20. I'm a bit of a sucker when it comes to things like that, so I loaned him the $20. He told me he would give it back in a couple of days. Well, I didn't see Mark again for a very long time. He came over to our house while I was sleeping and tried to force some gabapentin pills on my sister. She of course did not accept, but I guess he left them there. A few days later, I was sleeping in my bed. Well, I guess that was a silly thing to say. Where else would I be sleeping? And suddenly someone was pounding on our front door. It was Mark. I didn't wake up at first. I sleep with earplugs in my ears. But my sister was awake and she was pretty scared. He was demanding that we pay him for the $20 for the pills he left behind, which we had gotten rid of. We had at this time reported Mark to the police because we didn't want to get in trouble. Well, he kept pounding on the door, and when my sister wouldn't answer the door, he started pounding on the window. At this point, I didn't want to have anything to do with him, and he came over to my bedroom window, which I do leave unlocked like a moron. He started trying to open the window. He was yelling and screaming about that $20. It was $20 that I didn't owe him. I kept scrambling and looking for my phone to call the police. People who know me know I lose my phone all the time, and I couldn't find it. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my stun gun, and I pushed the button, and it zapped. He heard it, and he got the picture, and he left. I didn't see Mark again for like a year. He was in the Dollar Tree when I was in there, and when I came out, he started asking me, "Hey Jake, where's that $28 you owe me?" I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. I loaned him $20 and he never paid it back to me. I made that very clear to him. So then he's like, "Okay, I owe you $20, so now you owe me $8. I'm like, "I don't owe you $8 for pills that you left at my house that we didn't pay for, nor did we want. And actually, if you didn't know already, we let the police know that you did that and they took the pills. I don't owe you anything." Well, he had his big friend with him, and again they sort of like walked up to me and they were trying to intimidate me. I don't get intimidated very easily. I reached into my messenger bag, yes, I carry a messenger bag, and pulled out my stun gun, which looks like a small flashlight. I pushed the button and it zapped. Interestingly and coincidentally enough, a cop car pulled into the parking lot at that time, so they retreated. I thought I was done with Mark at that point. Alas, that was not true. A couple of months ago, my sister and I heard somebody outside. We went around looking. I knew I heard somebody, and you know me, I'm not going to hear something and assume, oh, it's a ghost or something like that. I hear a noise, I'm going to assume it's something important. I called around. I pushed the button on my stun gun, letting someone know if they're trying to get into my house, I have something. Well, guess who we found in our basement? Yep, it was Mark. I don't know what he was trying to do, if he was trying to steal something or do something to us because of this weird amount of money that he thinks we owed him. Well, let's just say he was sitting in a jail cell that night. You know, this makes me think a lot. My sister and I lived here for 7 years, and I've had more scary stories to tell about things that happened in this town than anywhere else in my life. Yeah, I think we're going to be moving. Maybe not in the too far future.
Signs. I don't think a lot of people really realize how scary it can be to live out in the country. I mean, really. Sometimes people hear something and they don't know what it is. Oh, so scary. Or maybe they will see some weird guy, dressed shabby and acting weird. Newsflash, that's really the majority of people who live in the country. And it probably seems weird or scary to people who listen to creepypasta narrators, because they simply live in a different environment. But hey, I've lived in the country my entire life, and that sort of thing is run-of-the-mill. Do you want to hear a really scary country story? I mean, a really scary one. Make sure you're wearing your diapers, because this one is pretty out there. I grew up in a house that was off a dirt road. Not a gravel road, a dirt road. There was a small creek on the west side of the property, so there was a small bridge that went over it. Not really important, but just setting the scene. I lived in that house all my life growing up, and it was a shabby place to live. But I never thought of it that way, because it was my home. There are some pretty awful people who do some pretty awful things if you travel far enough out in the country. And no, I don't mean there are inbred rednecks who torture and eat you for dinner like in those movies. But there are people who easily break the law, make drugs, hoard weapons, have animal fights, etc. And for the most part, the law looks the other way, because they don't want to disappear. I'm sure most of you probably think I'm full of it, but just consider yourself lucky that you have never had an experience like the one I had with my friend Joe. Of course, that is not his real name, because I don't want anyone to know who we are. And growing up, we was always warned about places we shouldn't go, while we were allowed to explore the local hills. There was an area far off that we were told not to go near. There were supposedly signs on the trees that would warn you to go back. That was what my family always told me. They described the signs and told me if I ever saw them, turn around and get out of there as quick as you can. The people who put those signs up were dangerous, but if you listened to the sign and turned around and left, they wouldn't do a thing to you. I can't tell you how many times in life I always heard, if you're going out into the woods and you see the signs, just turn away. There is nothing to be scared of unless you go past those trees that have the signs on them. Well, as boys get older, two things happen to them. They get both braver and they get stupider. But they also get curious. And to tell you the truth, Joe and I have been exploring the hills around our home for years and years, and we had never even come across these so-called signs that we weren't supposed to go past. Around the time we were 13 years old, we didn't even believe they existed. They were either something that parents created in order to keep their children from traveling too far into the woods and getting lost or something to scare us like the boogeyman. We didn't believe they existed. And so for a while, Joe and I were going to begin to go deeper and deeper into the woods until we found these signs. Either we would find them or we would not. If we didn't find them, and of course we believed that we would not find them, then we would prove that the adults were just full of crap. And that was exactly what we expected to do. It was easy for us to take trips out into the woods whenever we wanted to. We were 13-year-old boys who grew up in the country. Camping and hiking was sort of expected. So we took trips often and would sometimes be out for days. We would take our fishing poles with us, and then we would try to find a new creek to fish in. We never really caught much because there weren't too many big fish in the creeks, but it was our thing. And we went further and further into the woods, trying to find these warning signs that everyone always talked about. And weeks went by, and we didn't find anything like that. We found some old abandoned tool sheds and things like that, and of course we did fish. But we never saw anything that indicated to us that there were people out there like that. Of course, since this is a scary story, you probably know that we had to find something. And yeah, we did find something one time. We had gone out this time, again with fishing equipment. I did wish at one point, however, that we would have taken hunting equipment. That would have helped us out a whole lot more. This was a multiple-day trip. We were going deeper into the hills than we ever had before. Our parents were fine with us doing that. We took a tent and camping equipment. We camped one night and went out the next day. I have to tell you that the area was absolutely beautiful. That was really the reason we did those trips, as after a short period of time, we didn't ever expect to find anything. Joe called out to me. I had been walking a bit away from him, but he sounded really excited. I didn't know exactly what he was excited about, but I was about to get the shock of my life. There was a sign on a tree. It was nailed to the tree, but it was a large metal sign. It looked like a street sign, but it didn't have a normal street sign decoration. The sign read, "Go back, or you're dead." There was some other decorative stuff on it as well. At first I couldn't tell you how I felt. I was a bit excited too, and a little scared. But I was also a bit skeptical. The sign looked like it had been there for a really long time too. It could have been put there as a joke or something. "What do we do?" I asked Joe. He thought we should go past the sign. I mean, he didn't take it seriously at all. And I was cool with that. I didn't take it seriously at all either at first. So Joe and I went walking past the sign, and we quickly came to a similar sign, and we walked in, and then we found more. There were several signs hanging on different trees. They were all telling us to get out. They were all telling us to get out, or or get the F out, or you're gonna die. The signs were piling up, and I was beginning to get nervous. I even suggested we really should turn back at one point, and I was serious. It was beginning to get scary. Before I could tell him anything, though, I heard a crunching sound. When I turned and looked, I felt my stomach go completely cold. A young man was standing not too far from us, holding a shotgun that was pointed right at us. "Didn't you see the signs?" the guy asked. "Damn it!" Joe and I immediately and instinctively put our hands up. We didn't say anything, though, because we hadn't thought we would ever be in this situation. "Didn't you see the damn signs?" he asked again. I was terrified. I can tell you at that instant I thought I was going to die. I knew my life was completely over. Joe told the guy we hadn't seen anything. We were sorry, and if he let us go, we would leave and never come back. "Anyone ever come this far before or did?" he said, still pointing the gun at us. But he hadn't shot us yet. It almost looked like he wasn't completely comfortable with the idea, though. That gave us a little bit of hope. We begged to be let go. The guy kept the gun pointed at us, but he began looking around, like he was trying to see if anyone else was around. "Do you know what's going on out here?" he asked us. We explained that we didn't. We didn't see anything. We had no idea what was going on. We swore that we would never mention to anyone that we had found anything. And at the time we meant it. The guy looked down for a moment. And at that moment, though, I thought he was about to kill us both. "Get out," he told us. "No one saw you but me. But if you don't get out of this area, and get out way quick, I'll change my mind. If I see you in town, or in school, or anything, and you tell anyone anything, I will kill you. Go!" And we did. We ran. We were surprised we didn't pee our pants. We ran. We packed up our tent and then we ran some more. We ran until it was dark and we had to put up a new camp. And we spent the entire night terrified. We thought the guy would come and track us down and kill us for not getting far enough away. Every sound was terrifying. We got up right when the sun appeared. We packed up and left. We were not comfortable until we got back to my house. But that's not the end of the story. I remembered what the guy told us. And one part of it was if he saw us in school. When school started that fall, we saw the guy in school. The first time I did, I almost messed myself. He was a high school senior, and we were freshmen. It was a scary shock, and the look he gave us when he first saw us was terrifying. We did end up talking to him eventually. He never told us what was going on out there, but he did tell us that he had never killed anyone before, but the people he was out there with had. He told us that we were lucky that he was the one who caught us out there. If it had been anyone else, we would be dead. It would have happened in a second. I would like to tell you that this is the first time I ever told this story. It isn't. And it happened a long time ago. But I'm still too scared to put my name on it. Unwelcome visitor. I grew up out in the country. Both my parents worked, and it was not unusual for me to be home by myself. I mean, I had a brother and sister,
but sometimes they would be at their friends' houses. They tended to have a lot of sleepovers and play dates or whatever you want to call them. And I wasn't really the type to have a lot of friends, so I was home a lot. And honestly, it was because that was what I liked. I was 12 years old, and I was home alone on a Sunday. Both of my parents were at work and my siblings were not home. And there was a knock at the door. I got up and went over to the door. I looked out the window and there was a creepy-looking man outside of the door. I had never seen him before in my life. Now, I lived on a dirt street that only had about 5 houses on it. They were pretty far apart from each other as well. Like getting people to come and knock on the door, especially people you didn't know, was unusual. I knew, however, it was not any of my neighbors. Also, living where we did, things were a lot different than they are in cities. We didn't always lock our door, and we weren't normally suspicious of people. We had a door and a screen door. I opened up the regular door. I only got it halfway open though, when I noticed something. The man was holding a knife at his side. It was a hunting knife, and I had no idea at all why he was holding it, but I had a good idea. He noticed that I noticed it. He reached for the handle on the screen door. However, as he was doing that, I had time to go and slam the regular door shut. He had the screen door open, though, and got his hand on the doorknob of the main door. He was able to turn the knob and get the door open. However, right before he did, I got the chain locked on the door. The man began pounding on the door, and I knew the chain would not hold forever. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran into the kitchen and I grabbed a knife from the knife block. Coming back to the door, I began slashing the knife through the small opening in the door. I cut him again. He began screaming and yelling, and hit the door really hard a few more times. I cut him again though, and he must have realized he was not winning this proposition. He screamed at me some gibberish before running out down the street. I locked the door and called the sheriff. The guy was picked up later. He was a convicted child molester, and somehow he knew my parents weren't home. So yeah, that was terrifying. It was good that I noticed the knife before it was too late though. Possum hunting. My grandparents have always lived where I would describe as in the middle of nowhere. When I was younger, back before the internet was really a big thing, they were the only house around in the hollow. There were no streetlights, and at night I could go outside and lie in the yard and look up at the stars. There were more stars there than I've ever seen as an adult, and I could even see the Milky Way. And sometimes I'd like to look up into the sky and spin around until I got dizzy. I'd fall into the thick grass and look up at the stars that still seemed to be spinning. The house itself was nestled between 2 hills, with another marking the border of the back of the property. But the property itself was fairly large. Behind the house, they had a barn. They kept chickens and hunting dogs, and they had a personal farm where they grew beans, tomatoes, lettuce, and so much more. I loved to visit so much, and in the summer, I'd help with the farm. Well, as much as a little kid could help. Basically, they'd hand me a bowl of beans to string, and I'd probably do a half-assed job that one of them would have to redo later, but they never said anything. One of my fondest memories was something my grandpa and I used to do together. He called it possum hunting. Well, he said it with an accent and no teeth, so it kind of came out as pottin' hunting, but I always knew what he meant. Possum hunting was basically my grandpa and me going out after dark with flashlights and looking to make sure there were no possums in the chicken food, random barrels that were around, or in the barn or shed. I'm really not sure that it was ever something that needed to be done, or if he just did it for me, but I always loved it. As an animal lover, I would never have done any real hunting, though it was a common thing in my family. And just spooking possums away from chickens didn't bother me. I don't really remember if we ever even saw a possum. I remember once my dad went with us, and he shook a barrel to scare me and make me think a possum was in it, but I don't know that we ever saw a real one. Still, this game continued as I grew older, and whenever I'd visit my grandparents, my grandpa would ask me to go possum hunting. When I was a teenager, I'd just laugh and brush off the invitation, because surely he didn't expect me, a mature woman, to go outside and chase fictitious possums. I feel a bit bad about that, now that he's gone, but there was a time in my later teens when I got my head out of my ass and realized this tradition was important to my grandpa. This was around the time that I was caring for my nephew. I had moved in with my brother when his wife left him to help him take care of his kid. The little bugger grew on me, and for a year or so, before someone else got custody, I was a surrogate mom to him. It was for this reason that when visiting my grandparents with my nephew, and the old man came up to me and said, "You want to go possum hunting?" I said yes. He was surprised, and his toothless smile grew. I turned to my nephew, who was about 3 at the time, and said, "You want to go possum hunting?" He had no idea what we were talking about, but the excitement with which I said it was contagious. He nodded emphatically. My grandpa grabbed the flashlights as I put my nephew's shoes on. It was summer, so no need for coats. No one else in the family wanted to join, as usual, so in a few minutes we stepped out the back door and switched on our flashlights. Unlike when I was younger, there were a few streetlights down by the road, but they were far enough away to not give much light to the property behind the house. There was a back porch light, but no one turned it on. This was more of a game than anything, and it was fun to leave that light off for the atmosphere. The first area behind the house was the dog pens. When I was younger, they'd been full of hunting dogs of all sorts. Now there were 2, one of them nursing a litter of puppies we had played with earlier in the day. So we passed many empty pens as we walked, shining the light back and forth. My nephew stayed at my side and looked back and forth with the light, his eyes wide. I imagine he was expecting monsters to be hiding in every shadow, like I had back in the day. He had his own little flashlight and would shine it in the darkest spots. I put my hand over my nose as we passed the old outhouse. I was pretty sure the old man still used it, though I'm pretty sure it was illegal to have it set up like he did. But it had been there forever. Finally, we came up to the barn, which was decaying more and more every year. Without any maintenance, there were broken and missing boards. They were gray and black and crooked, and in the flashlight beams it was creepy. My grandpa put a hand up to indicate that we should stop, and creeped slowly over to some sort of bin sitting outside the door. He creeped really close to it and kicked it, jumping back quickly like he expected to be attacked. I smiled, knowing there was nothing in the bin, and this was just part of the hunt. I felt my nephew's fingers curl around mine, and I gave him a squeeze. My grandpa crept back up to the bin, put his hand on the lid, and paused for a long time. Then suddenly, he ripped off the lid and kicked the bin over, banging his flashlight loudly against it. He had kicked it away from us, so we would not have been able to see if anything had been in it. He hooted and yelled, "Get out of here," at the invisible possum, and my nephew dropped my hand, stomped his foot on the ground, and shouted with him, "Go away!" Grandpa turned around and raised a fist in triumph. "We told that possum," he said, and my nephew, having lost all his fear, cheered and pumped his fist. From that point on, he walked ahead of me, next to Grandpa, and showed no fear. "We have to check the barn now," Grandpa said. Well, again, he said it without any teeth and a thick accent, but I knew what he meant. The old barn door was warped, and I had to help him drag it open. Their chickens usually roosted among the trees on the hills, but a lone hen was disturbed by our presence and clucked disapprovingly at us before walking off to find new roosting spots. It had been many years since I'd been in this barn, and the rickety nature of it scared me. It was sad how it had decayed. It felt like it could fall on us at any moment. My grandpa and nephew were poking their flashlights into shadows everywhere. I looked around with mine and noticed what looked like a broken half of a bear trap. It was probably a trap for some smaller animal, but I had only seen them as bear traps on TV, so that's what it was to me. There were some empty buckets and rotten old rags that had been chewed by mice. An old horseshoe brought back memories of my childhood. My uncle had had horses when I was very young. Sadly, he passed away, and I don't know whatever happened to them. I just remember him riding on the horse with me, and deciding at that moment that one day I would have a horse. I haven't managed that yet. A loud cracking sound snapped me out of my thoughts, and I swung my flashlight towards the noise. I heard my nephew cry, "Get out of here, Possum!" And I saw the back door of the barn had been kicked open, obviously by Grandpa. One of the boards had decided it liked being closed better, and had completely broken off and stuck to the jamb. That was the crack I had heard. My heart slowed its rapid pace just a bit with this realization. I walked through the rest of the empty barn, leaving the memories there in the shadows, where they probably sit and rot to this day. Walking out of the back of the barn, we shone our flashlights around, and saw nothing in the trees on the hills that flanked the property. My nephew chittered on about how good we had done at scaring those possums, and Grandpa shushed him. "We have to be really quiet now," he said. "See that shed?" he asked, pointing at the small shack across the yard. It was where they kept their farming stuff back when they kept up the farm. Sadly, they weren't able to keep it up these days, so I had no idea what was in there now. But I knew Grandpa was just trying to scare my nephew. "That's where the big possum hides." I remembered him saying that to me as a kid, but I was pretty sure it wasn't the shed that he had said it about. But it had been so long ago that I really couldn't remember. I remembered that my child eyes saw all of this as if it were a horror movie. Every shadow was amplified, every sound a possible monster. For some reason, I had enjoyed being scared, and it seemed my nephew was no different. To him, this game was real, and they were scaring off the monster possums to save the chickens. My nephew's eyes were big as he listened to my grandpa. He nodded, indicating that he would be quiet, and we crept across the stretch of grass towards the now rickety old building. It was much smaller than the barn, more akin to a shed anyone would have in their backyard. But just like the barn, it was old and made of wood which was now rotting away. As we got closer, I noticed a scuffling sound. It was a light sound, like someone scuffing their feet on the ground. I listened carefully, sure it was just a normal sound of the night that I wasn't familiar with, but I couldn't place it. We crept closer and closer to the shed, and I realized this was where the sound was coming from. I began to wonder if something was in there. It occurred to me that Grandpa was quite hard of hearing, and probably didn't notice it. Before I could say anything, there was a loud shriek and the sound of something scratching at the rotted wood. I grabbed my nephew and had him in my arms in a heartbeat. To my surprise, my grandfather continued toward the shed as if he'd heard nothing. I knew he was hard of hearing, but I didn't think he was completely deaf. Surely he had heard that shriek. I reached out for his arm to stop him, but he sped up and was quickly out of my reach. There were more shrieks and bangs as I yelled at my grandpa to stop, but he just went on and opened the door. I clutched my nephew to me and prepared to run when something large jumped from the shed. It was my brother. He and my grandpa shined a flashlight on me, and my nephew and I burst out laughing. I heard, "The look on your face," and "got her," amidst the laughs. Obviously, while we were in the barn, he had snuck around us and gotten into the shed. My nephew jumped out of my arms and said, "I wasn't scared." He ran and jumped into his father's arms and joined them in laughing. Traitor. I scowled at them as they came over, my brother slapping me hard on the back as he liked to do, knocking some of the wind out of me. "Don't do that," I snapped when I caught my breath. "Ooh, she's mad now," he quipped, and they laughed at me some more. Feeling very foolish and not wanting to see the humor in it, I turned to walk back toward the house. They followed me, still laughing. I stormed past the barn and covered my nose as we approached the outhouse. "Hey, anyone need a shit?" my brother asked vulgarly. I rolled my eyes, but they couldn't have seen me as they were behind me. "Is it the silent treatment now?" he asked. I was fuming and couldn't decide if I wanted to be mad or pretend I was fine. As I thought about it, my brother caught up to me and stopped me for a minute. He handed me his son, and we stood there and waited for Grandpa to catch up with us. I'd wished he found a better place to wait. I hated smelling the outhouse. "I could shit," Grandpa said to my surprise. I was always told he was a vulgar old man, but in front of me he never swore or anything. "You really still use that thing?" my brother asked him. "Well, sometimes," he said, vaguely. My brother looked a little uncomfortable and asked, "You want us to wait?" "I think I can shit by myself," he chuckled as he reached the door. My brother shrugged and we turned toward the house when we heard a shriek for the second time that night. But it wasn't my brother this time. It was Grandpa. The old man stepped backwards and fell onto his back as the outhouse door swung open. In the darkness, with just our flashlights, we could see only a dog-sized shape emerge from the small building and dive for the old man's face. Whatever it was attacking my grandpa's face, clawing at it, and his screams were somewhat inhuman, but definitely derived from blood-curdling pain and fear. I shined my flashlight on it. It turned its grotesque face towards me. It was the biggest, scariest-looking possum I had ever seen in my life. And those things looked scary to begin with, but this was worse. I don't think animals can be evil, but if one could, it was this one. My brother reacted and ran up to the possum and kicked it like he was going for a field goal. He was a huge guy, and the possum was sent flying through the air. When it landed, it ran off into the wood. We helped Grandpa back up, and we knew we would have to get him to a hospital. We went back to the house and my nephew ran inside and shouted happily about how we'd scared off the boss possum. At first everyone thought it was just a story, but when Grandpa entered the room and looked a bit worse for wear, I told them the story the last time we ever went possum hunting. However, to the day he died, whenever he'd see me he'd ask me with a wink,
You wanna go possum hunting?
One snowy evening. This is absolutely a very scary story that happened to me a couple of decades ago. For a while, I haven't really wanted to tell it that much, though. It was just way too scary of a memory for me to have. I used to live in a one-bedroom apartment. I lived alone, and I didn't have any pets. I pretty much live that way now, too, because I really like it. I do have a bit of an odd quirk, though. You might think it's odd because I live alone. But even though I live alone in the house, I have to sleep with my bedroom door closed. If I leave the door open, I absolutely will not even fall asleep. I really don't know why this is the case, but that is something that continues to this day. This happened during the winter months. I come home from work, did my normal routine that I do after a day of work, and I can't tell you that I really remember much about the day, though. I was pretty positive it was snowing outside, too, and that always makes me a little sleepy as well. I woke up and my room was, of course, pitch black. I don't even have my clock facing my bed, because the light from the numbers would keep me awake. So I didn't even know what time it was. All I knew was that it was still dark, and I could see the snow still falling outside of the house. I wasn't really sure what woke me up either. All I knew was that it was a pretty jarring way to wake up. My mind was still a little bit fuzzy from waking up like that. After looking around and listening, and not hearing anything that was unusual, I decided it was a chance thing, and I decided to just go back to sleep. It was when I was laying down then that I heard it. The doorknob of my bedroom door was being turned, and the door was being slowly opened. There was no doubt about that at all. Someone had to have broken into my house, and that was probably what had woken me up. I wasn't sure how to handle this. I don't believe in the supernatural, so I didn't for one moment think that it was a ghost. I knew it was a break-in, but I didn't know what the intentions of that person was. I decided not to move and pretend I was sleeping. Yeah, I know, that doesn't sound very courageous, but I had a good reason for it. If the intruder was simply there to steal things and not hurt me, confronting him could make the situation a lot worse. I've heard plenty of stories of people having a break-in that turned into a violent encounter. I figured that my health and life were worth more than anything I owned. So I just pretended to be asleep, and that I hadn't noticed anything at all. It was difficult and scary doing that, but other than slightly opening my eye here and there in order to look around, I didn't move or indicate in any way that I was awake. Hearing an intruder walking around in your room is a really tense thing, especially when I heard him going through things in my room, opening my drawers in my dresser, and things like that. But mostly throughout the encounter, I just kept my eyes closed. After a period of time, it was just quiet in my room, but I hadn't heard anything that would have indicated that the guy had left the room. But I also hadn't heard anything at all. So I began wondering if I should look quickly. I very slowly opened my eyes to check out what was going on. And I don't know why, and I don't know how, but I picked the moment to open my eyes when the guy was looking right at my face. It was too late to close them back up. I don't know how long the next moment lasted, but it seemed like a long time when our eyes locked. Both of us must have been expecting the other to do something, but it was tense and very frightening. Well, he bolted out the bedroom door, and when he did, rather than pursue him, I got up, closed and locked the door, and called the police. He dropped the things he was stealing from me. I guess in order to get away, I don't know. He was still picked up by the police. He was connected to several burglaries in the neighborhood. No idea what happened to him, and I really don't care. This incident happened about 1.5 years ago. I was visiting my boyfriend one afternoon in San Pedro, California, and it was really warm that day, so a lot of people were outside. My boyfriend lives in a sketchy part of town, but it's all he can afford. The street he lives on is cracked and bumpy, and it's kind of narrow. It's almost like an obstacle course on garbage day, because people will put their cans out on the street for collection. After we'd had a particularly fun afternoon together, he had to go to his job for the evening shift. My boyfriend walked me down to the street, to my car, before leaving, himself, just to make sure I got there safely. Once we reached it, we said goodbye, and he turned back to go to his car garage so he could leave. As he re-entered the building, my eye caught some movement on the sidewalk near me. A man was rummaging through one of the garbage cans put out that day. This man looked pretty dirty and old, and his hair was white and messy. He had really raggedy clothes on, as well as being barefoot, and held an empty bottle for multivitamins in one hand. The sight of this man really disturbed me, because I hadn't noticed him at first, and he had an odd way of walking, like his hips were moving side to side when he walked. I hoped I would go unnoticed by him, at least until I got in my car, because he seemed like he was possibly strung out on something, and would likely be unpleasant. Unfortunately, he looked up from the garbage can and made eye contact with me as I was unlocking my door, because my Prius makes a beeping noise when it unlocks. I silently sat down in my seat and closed the door. The man, still staring at me, shouted out, "Hey! Hey!" and moved towards me. Beginning to feel panicked, I started my car, and I quickly turned the wheel to pull away from the curb. As I began to move, he then bolted up to the front of my car to block me. I stopped, not sure what to do next. He then raised his arms, seemingly in a beckoning pose, as if he was daring me to hit him with my car. I tried to yell at him through the window to stop what he was doing and leave me alone, and I began crying in hysteria. The man then proceeded to approach the car, and then he leaned forward onto the hood, staring alternatively at his vitamin bottle and back at me with a weird, disgusted look on his face. I honestly didn't know what to do. What was this guy trying to do? Had I offended him? I don't see how I could have. I'm pretty unthreatening in appearance, a clean-cut, petite 25-year-old woman who looks fairly young at first glance. I may have looked frightened to him, but I don't think that should cause offense, since he had startled me. In any case, he was physically blocking my exit at this point, and I was terrified. I begged him to let me go, but he wouldn't move. Almost instinctively, I picked up my cell phone and dialed 911. As he watched, I babbled into the phone to the operator that a man was on my car. The operator repeatedly tried to calm me down, asking me what I was referring to. "Sorry, ma'am? Who? What man? Where are you located?" I was in such a panic that all I could get out was, "Please hurry, he's on my car and he won't let me go." After a few moments, which seemed to me like forever, the man finally stood back up and backed away. He must have realized what I was doing, so after that, he slowly moved on. Frozen in panic, I watched him leave in the rearview mirror until he rounded the corner. Once he was out of sight, I drove away as quickly as I could. The operator called out to me, "Ma'am, are you alright?" Snapping out of my anxiety, I replied yes, and hung up the line. As I drove away, I noticed a neighboring woman had been observing nearby, probably the whole time, but had done nothing. I could tell she wanted to say something to me, but I just wanted to get out of there. So I kept going. I called my boyfriend to tell him what had happened, since he had not observed any of this. While all this had been happening, he had driven off to work, and had just missed the whole thing right before it started. Since that time, He just made sure to see me off, no matter the situation, or even if he was running late for something. And he felt terrible that he hadn't known. I still visit him there at his apartment building, despite what happened, and now I keep a wary eye out when I'm outside, even during the day, such as when this happened. It was probably the scariest thing that I ever experienced, certainly in the city for sure. I urge everyone else to try and be aware of their surroundings these days. A story that goes through 3 generations. And like the title says, this story goes back 3 generations, starting with my grandma, my mom's mom, then my mom, and last me. First, you gotta understand my grandma was a caring, loving, no-nonsense Christian woman. She just didn't tell her grandchild scary stories to scare us. So when I was in my teens, and my grandma shared the story with me, I was all ears. My grandma was born in the mid-1930s, so this would have taken place around the early 1940s. She grew up dirt poor, and with 11 brothers and sisters, and it was on a farm. So playtime came very little, and when it did come, she and her sister, who was closer to her age, would go and play in the yard, making dirty pies and such. It was one of those afternoons that both of them were playing close to a cornfield. Both of them heard something running hard and fast to them. Now, Grandma said no one should have been running after them, and this scared them both, so they did what every scared child does, run for Mama. They got into the house crying and slammed the door behind them. A god-awful banging on the door started from the top of the door to the bottom, making the door shake. My great-grandma told the girls to open the door, that they had a cat's tail closed in it. But they wouldn't do it, and children in that time didn't go against their mom and dad, so great-grandma knew they were scared. All this time the knocking was non-stop, so she went to the door to show her children nothing was there but a cat. Now Grandma said they only had one cat, and when the door was open, the knocking stopped, and the cat was sitting in the yard under a tree, happy. Grandma said she didn't know what it was, and to be honest, she didn't care to know. And for her, that was the end. Now fast forward to the 1970s, and to my mom, and again she is the same way as Grandma. No nonsense. My grandma's father lived next door, and it was my mom and uncle's responsibility to take him his dinner every night. Now before my great-grandpa moved into the house next door, my grandma blocked the back door, so it was one way in and one way out. There was a big patch of woods right out the back door, and they were scared that at his age he might walk out that door and get lost in the night. But back to the story. One night my mom and uncle were getting his dinner ready and talking when knocking from the top to the bottom of the door started and shaking the whole door. My mom said her and her brother got the hell out of there. No questions asked. It scared them. She and my uncle have said they didn't believe it was a person. It was different from that. She said she just didn't know what it was and was happy not to know. Now for me and my husband, we live next door to the same uncle and grandma. To help you understand why we did what we did, you have to understand my grandma had a small heart attack not too long before this. We lived in a small mobile home, and it was old, so didn't always have the best cell service. Keep this all in mind. This was the early 2000s, and late at night, and we both had worked a long day and were about to fall asleep when we heard a hard knocking on the front door. We both jumped out of bed, running to the door, thinking something was wrong with Grandma, and my uncle couldn't get to us on the phone. I remembered my husband yelling my uncle's name, and we're coming, and to hold on. The knocking was non-stop, even when my husband was unlocking the door. But when he opened the door, no one was there. Now we live in the country, like only a few houses, and we had no places for anyone to hide in the yard. And plus, we had one of those big night lights outside that the light company put out, so we could see good. And there was no one. Of course we were both shocked, and sleep didn't come back so easy. Now here's where my story changes from the others. It happened again the next night, the very same way as it did the first night, only this time my husband grabbed his baseball bat and ran outside, but there was nothing to run after. He said outside of some cats and bugs, no one was out there. Now, for me, I'm a God-believing woman, but I believe there are things in this world we don't know of and do not understand. I can't tell what it was, and I now have a daughter that I can't help but wonder if it will happen to her. Every generation was a little older than the next, so she's getting closer to the age I was when it happened to me. So the only thing is to sit and wait, I guess. Evan. When I was a sophomore in high school, I made a new friend. There was this kid named Evan, whose family had just moved in from out of state. His family was from Philadelphia, and they had just moved to our more rural community. It was the first time they had moved since Evan had been born, so he had to leave behind all of his friends that he had had all of his life. Also, not having ever moved before, he had never been in the position of trying to have to make new friends. I lived in an area where there wasn't a whole lot of moving in or moving out. So whenever a new kid came around, it was really difficult for them to make friends. Cliques were very well established by high school, and even a long time before that. So things were stacked up pretty badly against Evan from the beginning. Evan was also a bit different from the people in our area. He always wore black all the time. He would sit in the back of the classroom. He rarely talked to anyone, including teachers, when they asked him questions. About a month after Evan appeared at our school, he and I began talking. He approached me in lunch, and he began talking to me. We realized that we had a lot in common. The two of us then became really quick buddies. It didn't take long for the two of us to become fast and best friends, actually. When October that year came around, he and I decided to go camping. I liked camping more in the fall than in the summer. I sometimes would go hunting too, but I didn't really go on trips to solely go hunting. But I liked being out in the wilderness when it was cooler outside and when the leaves were falling. There is just something about that time of year that I really enjoy. It's nicer to try and keep warm than it is to try and keep cool. So Evan and I took a long weekend in order to go camping. It was the Columbus Day weekend, and my school always made that into a 4-day weekend. They did parent and teacher conferences on Friday, so students didn't have to go to school. So after getting out of school on Thursday, Evan and I packed up, and we decided to head out into the country. Since it was October, we really didn't have a lot of daylight time before we had to set up our camp. We walked a bit into the dark, and then we used lights to set up our tent after we built our fire, of course. We had a good dinner and talked for a while before we decided to go to bed. Like I mentioned, I did enjoy casual hunting, so I had brought my rifle with me. It was by the opening of the tent. Evan and I shared the one large tent. We talked for a while before drifting off to sleep. The next day went really well. You know that one morning that seems to happen every fall? You wake up and you see that leaves from the trees finally decided to give up their leaves, which then began falling and gathering up on the ground. It was great and beautiful. We took ourselves much deeper into the woods and just had a completely fun time. The next evening went pretty much like the previous one. We had a good dinner, good camp and everything. Then, the following day was pretty much the same. We didn't do any hunting really. It was all just hiking, enjoying nature, and that sort of thing. The trip went fine, all the way into the last night. On Sunday night, we set up our last camp. Evan was acting like something was bothering him, but every time I tried to figure out what it was, he dismissed it. He insisted he was just tired, which was unfortunate because we went on this trip to relax and have fun. That night, I woke up when there seemed to be some light in the tent. I opened my eyes up, but like I normally sleep, I had a blanket wrapped around my eyes. It was thin enough to let some of the light through to wake me up though. Not knowing what was going on, I just decided to not indicate that I had woken up. I mean, as far as I knew, Evan had taken out some dirty magazines to read by lamplight and he was jerking off to them. I didn't want to embarrass him by immediately just looking out. I waited for a while, knowing that the light would not let me go back to sleep. But it had been on a long time, and the light was still on. So, I decided that I would peek out from under my blanket and see what was happening. Okay, now I'm sure there will be people who hear this who will call me gay for peeking on my friend when I thought he was jerking off. But I dare a single one of you to deny that you have never looked at another naked guy in a locker room shower. We all do it, so let's not hear about that. I peeked out, and what I saw was not at all what I had expected to see. I saw Evan sitting in the corner of the tent with a flashlight on in my direction. That made it really difficult to see because of the light, and I couldn't figure out what he was doing. The light was only on me, nothing else. Suddenly the flashlight went off. I was worried that he had noticed that I had woke up and kept pretending to be asleep. After that, I waited to see if the flashlight would come back on, but it never did. It took a while, but I eventually went back to sleep. So the following day, things were back to normal again. We had a nice day for the last day, even though Evan seemed tired again. But it was a good trip. Evan and I did begin drifting apart after that. I was not sure why, but it just seemed like we didn't click as well as we did before. He began making other friends, and he spent much less time with me. The following spring, I was on Instant Messenger. Yep, this happened a while ago. And a guy I casually knew named Jim sent me a message. And I will never, ever forget the talk that I had with him that night. "Hey, Sean, you used to be friends with Evan, right?" he asked me. "Yeah, pretty good for a short while," I responded. "Why? Did you ever go camping with him last October?" "Yeah," I responded. I still did not see if this was important in any way. "Holy shit. He was gonna kill you," Jim told me. "What the hell?" I responded. Jim explained to me that Evan hangs out with his twin brother. They had recently been up late playing video games, and he overheard Evan telling his brother about a camping trip he went on with someone last October. He had only gone on the trip because he had the feeling for a while that he wanted to kill someone. It had been an urge he had been having for a while, and was one of the reasons his family had left Philadelphia. He had gotten into a few violent altercations with former friends of his. He further said that he met this guy in the new school and pretended to befriend him with the intent on eventually killing him. And that would have been me. I was a bit of a loner, and he figured it would be easier to get away with it if he killed somebody who didn't have a lot of friends. "Well, why didn't he do it?" I asked. He said the guy woke up. He had also brought a rifle with him for hunting, and it wasn't that far from where he could grab it quickly. So he aborted. I didn't know what to think of this story, It sounded so weird. I also didn't know why he would have told Jim's brother about it. But Jim told me his brother was a bit of a freak who was into death and serial killers. He actually had serial killer trading cards. I didn't even know those existed. So I have to wonder, did Evan really plan on killing me? I mean, he may have just been making up the story in order to impress someone who likes serial killers. But then again, he told the story exactly as it had happened. He told Jim's brother about staring at me for nearly an hour, trying to get up the nerve to finally do it. But when he noticed me peek out from under my blanket, he quit. It seemed awfully accurate. I'll never really know. I'm not friends with Evan, and I have no idea what even happened to him after high school. I went off to college in a different state, and I remained there. But I will always wonder what may have happened if I hadn't peeked out from under that blanket. I might be dead. Writer. I have always wanted to write scary stories since I was younger. And although I think I am, and always have been, a very decent writer, I have never really been much of an idea guy. It's hard to think up new scary stories. That's especially so when there are so many ideas and things that have already been done. I wanted to come up with new ideas, and not just do the same thing over and over again. There is a lot of rural area around where I live, and I guess that was one of the things that inspired me to be a horror writer. The woods, and even the fields, can be a really scary place, where you can come up with all sorts of terrifying happenings. And also, it gets a lot darker out in that area than it does in urban areas. I know that mostly because I live in a more urban area at the moment. But anyway, on with the story. This happened in the fall. I was still in high school at the time. That was the time when I was writing the most stories. And I guess that was why I was running out of inspiration. I was a bit underwhelmed by the beginning of the school year that year. I wasn't having a challenging time. So I was looking for something to get my mind going. Of course, I thought that writing a scary story would be the thing to do. The only problem was that I was having a really hard time thinking of an idea. About the third week of school, I was really blocked for ideas. I decided to go for a walk at night. Sometimes going for a walk is a really good way to get new ideas for scary stories. So I went out for a long walk. Now, I live on a country road myself, but I wasn't that far away from a small town, and there were some neighborhoods around. I walked down the road in the dark, just trying to get my mind to come up with something. I walked on down off the gravel road, and actually made it to the paved road. I figured ideas were not coming to me yet, so I might as well keep on going. I walked into a neighborhood that a friend of mine lived in. I wasn't intending on going over to his house, but I was familiar with the area, so I could walk up and down the streets, and I would not have to worry about getting lost. Right on the edge of that neighborhood was a really small woods, and there were some houses there. I want to try and explain this as well as possible, so you can understand exactly what the area looked like. The woods were on the right side of the street that I was walking on. On the left side were houses that were facing the road that bordered the neighborhood that I was walking in. There was another line of houses that were facing away from that direction. So these two rows of houses had their backyards facing each other. Now, there was an old paved road that ran behind and through both rows of houses. There were a lot of trees lined up and down on both sides of the street. Plus, there were no street lamps, and there was rarely any light from the moon either. It got very, very dark back there. I debated whether or not I wanted to walk through that area. I had walked through it before with my buddy, but never by myself at nighttime. But I told myself that it would be a good idea, because maybe I would get a little scared, and maybe being scared would be enough to give me inspiration for a scary story. However, I wasn't feeling particularly scared that night, and I doubted deliberately trying to make myself scared was going to be inspiring. However, there were some houses there that had some outside dogs. I wouldn't see them, and I thought at the very least I would get a good jump scare. So, I decided to walk down that area. When I first started walking down the street, I could still see the leaves that were falling off the trees behind the two houses. But as I walked just a little bit further, it gradually almost went completely pitch black. I am sure that most of you have watched horror movies. One of the things we do when we watch those movies is brace ourselves for possible jump scares. And that was exactly what I was doing. I tensed up, and I was waiting for it to happen. As I kept walking, I didn't hear any noise other than the crunching of my own feet on the dead leaves on the ground. It was quiet, and I got tenser and tenser. I kept expecting the bark, but began getting apprehensive in expectation of it too. Even though I was hoping for a jump scare, I began to not really want it to happen. I think you all know the sort of feeling that I am trying to describe to you. The sound was nothing but a low grumbling sound, sort of like when a dog talks back to his owner, like he is mumbling under his breath. And that was it. I stopped walking. It was still dark, so I couldn't see the dog or much of anything. But I did look over in that direction that I had heard the dog make the sound. Really? I asked the dog. That is the scariest sound you could make?
When you strangle a dog, he can't bark at someone walking by.
I heard a voice from the direction of the dog tell me. And I experienced something much different than a jump scare just right then. It was something I hadn't experienced before, and I haven't experienced since. It was a wave of fear moving over my entire body. It was a cold dread. That is the only thing in my world I can think of could describe it. My legs reacted much quicker than my mind did, though. They picked up, and they began hauling butt down the street. The only thing I was thinking of was that I had to get to the end of this road and back into the light as quickly as possible. So I ran and almost tripped several times. I did not quit running until I got to a street lamp. At that point, I turned around and looked. I didn't see that anyone was coming after me. All I noticed was the trees covering the road and the leaves that were steadily falling from them. As before, it was completely quiet outside. I turned and began to go home. It took a while, but I calmed down. Now, I didn't get completely calm until I arrived home, and then I was still a bit on edge. But I guess I got what I was looking for. The funny thing is, this happened years in the past. I've written many scary stories and things since then, but never put the story down until now. Car sleeping. I hope the story is long enough to be considered to be read. It's really short, and I'm not really the best writer. When I was 18, I had to move out of my parents' house. Or more realistically, I was kicked out of their house. I stayed at the houses of some friends here and there, but I burned a lot of bridges doing that. By the fall of that year, I actually was living in my car. However, it was hard to find places to park and be able to sleep all night. If I parked in a parking lot of a store or an apartment complex, I ran the risk of being found out, because I didn't have a parking permit for that sort of area. Well, I ended up driving out to this more rural area that was around where I lived. so I would park along the side of a dirt or rocky road in order to sleep. I was off the road enough to allow anyone to drive by, and cop cars and such never really ventured out on those roads, so I didn't have anything to worry about. I fell asleep in the backseat of my car, covered in blankets because it was somewhat cold outside, and it was normally very easy for me to fall asleep because I was always tired. When I woke up, it was because I heard a banging noise. Someone was banging on the window of my car. I thought it was a cop or something, so I looked out from under the blanket. It had been a damp day, and the leaves had been falling heavily. All of my windows were completely covered with leaves. I couldn't see who or what had pounded on my car. Whoever it was, though, kept pounding on my window. Not only that, they began shaking the car, and I heard some yelling. I was unable to tell what it was that the person out there was even saying to me. It sounded like gibberish, but he kept on hitting the window and then shaking the car. Not knowing what to do, I decided I had to get in the front seat of my car and get out of there as quickly as possible. I started the car and started up the windshield wipers. I wasn't able to see anyone right in front of the car, but the banging and shaking was still going on. It was blurry in front of the car, and then I pulled out anyway. I drove away, unable to look back and see who it was that had been attacking my car. The back window was so covered with leaves, I just drove away. In the direction I was facing, it drove me deeper into the hills, so that ended up being a very scary drive for me. It was just terrifying. It was so dark, and I was so scared to stop my car at any point to clean off the windows. Fortunately, I eventually found a way to a paved road without having to turn around and go back to where I'd parked. I drove to a friend's house, told him what happened, and he let me sleep there for the rest of the night. I never found out anything about what had happened that night. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, feel free to click the subscribe button and the bell below, or wait for the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.